it's October. October is Gilbert Sorrentino month, so go to your bookstore and buy a book. And we're with Chris Sorrentino here. He's the author of The Fugitives. Oh, I got this horrible. Can we turn that off? No, I'll just keep it. Okay, so we got he's author of Fugitives and also Trance.
And that's even harder to see.
I think it comes in if I hold it right here. Okay, so Trance.
Uh,
And go buy 5 copies of this book too, because I don't think we plug Chris Sorrentino is a more accessible writer, I think, than his father. So so if you want to get buy a book and take a plane to Europe and stuff, read Trance or his new book. Your latest book is now Beacon now.
see.
See, okay. Okay, so I've been going through I spent like 4 or 5 weeks reading Mulligan Stew, going through it. I read the chapters. Not only did I do that, I talked to Chad Post. I talked to Tom Lucky, who was a student of his, and so
Yep,
we got
I
some
remember
stuff.
Tom.
And now we're talking to Chris Sorrentino, who I think since the last time we talked, he has kind of an active Substack that we'll put in the description here. It's a little bit more happening than it was 2 years ago. Am I right?
Well, 2 years ago, I didn't have one. So,
Okay, yeah.
so yeah.
So yeah, this is let's see. Okay, we're going. Okay, so we started at 9:30. Let me say first, yeah, this is okay, so yeah, so we have let me just show all the books that we have here. Okay, so we have Mulligan Stew. That's my copy there. And
Oh, I have the wrong edition. I have this edition.
that's
I mean, I can get that one. Actually, you
I'm
show
not
the
gonna
books, I'll get the new copy.
but yeah, and then there's Splendid Hotel, which is has a lot of the same characters in it. I think if Mulligan Stew's too much for you, I would suggest getting reading Splendid Hotel because it's like a you can read it in about an hour or so. Oh yeah, there's another one. And I have Flawless Play Restored, a Mask of Fungo here. This is done by so yeah, I guess I'll talk about that. So let me go to the Grove Press book, and in the interview, Gilbert says, let's see, what does he say? Oh yeah, okay, so he talks about the how it was rejected 28, 25, 28 times. Uh, he was further depressed by the fact that I completed Crystal Vision before Mulligan Stew had been accepted, and it too began making the rounds and being rejected, and for the same reasons, and often by the same people. So I had 2 manuscripts out in the iron world of trade publishing, and I was fairly well launched on Aberration of Starlight, with visions of that too being sent around with the 2 manuscripts, all 3 books swirling in the vast empyrean of greed and stupidity and contingency. So, 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 I mean, I
If
didn't
only he
realize,
could see things now.
I mean, I think I didn't realize like Mulligan Stew kind of came out when he was like 50. So, I mean, I
Mhm.
think Mulligan Stew's the book that most of us in the 80s read first. And a lot of it, I just talked to Steve Moore. I've had a little email exchange, and I think that was the first book he had read from Sorrentino. And so he was 50. So he wasn't young. I mean,
Well,
and I don't know if everybody followed his first 3 books
can
at the
I
time.
can I just interject here that one of the reasons why that was a book that was the introduction for a lot of my father's readers is because every other book of prose of his was out of print by the time that Mulligan Stew appeared. I mean, there really was no half-life for any of those books to speak of. His first novel, The Sky Changes, had gone out of print, I think, in the early 70s. His second and third novels, Steelwork and Imaginative Qualities, had both gone out of print. They were brought out by Pantheon. And Splendid Hotel had also gone out of print. That was brought out by New Directions. So there really wasn't any refuge for books like my father's, even back in those days when you could argue that trade publisher was more forgiving and more willing to invest in a slow selling author. I think my father must have represented a line that they couldn't cross because they eventually they took all of his books out of print and stopped publishing him altogether within, I don't know, a few years of Mulligan Stew's appearance.
Wow. So, did he? I mean, there was he wrote this book in 71 to 75. Were you at Westbeth or were you over living in St. Mark's by that
No,
time?
no, no. We were at Westbeth then. I don't really remember his beginning the book. I was, I guess, about 8 when he started it. So it was shortly after we had moved to the West Village. I do remember him coming to a conclusion of it because it was kind of a, it had become sort of this ordeal. I don't mean to suggest that it was agonizing or that he was undergoing any particular unusual difficulties, but just the day-to-day writing of a book for 4 years. As I later found out myself, writing a book every day for 4 years can wear you down. And I do remember when it was finished, and then what I remember mostly, because that occurred when I was older, like between 12 and 16, I suppose, was trying to sell it, which, as you pointed out earlier, was a matter of being turned down dozens of times, often in those days before simultaneous submissions had become commonplace. There were often, gaps of several months between submissions. And when the book was rejected, there were some rejections that were just, we hate this, but there were a lot of others that were kind of regretful in a way, like deeply, we sure wish we could publish this brilliant book, but we don't think that it's going to sell any copies at all, so we're going to pass on it. And I don't really remember the genesis of him bringing it to Barney Ross at Grove, but it was the solution in the end.
So, like a day for you when you were like 10 or 12, you would wake up, your dad would, he would be sitting there already, or when you woke up,
No,
or
no, no, no. I mean, my father had a pretty inflexible routine. That's how he preferred to live. And, I can see completely the attraction of that. My father would get up not too terribly early, maybe 8 o'clock, and he would shave, and he would usually wake me up on a school day. And then he would make breakfast for everybody. Um, he would go out and get the paper, and then he would bring it back home and he would sit and he would eat and drink coffee and read the paper till about maybe 10 a.m. And then he would go to his desk. And he did this 5 days a week. He usually took the weekends off. Sometimes he was doing other things. He was teaching at the new school during part of this period, so he had to prepare his classes and grade papers. He also was taking on freelance work at the time. He was a copy editor, so he copy edited a lot of books. He also did, other freelance assignments, more or less, just to keep the wolf from the door. And he would work generally until about 5 or 6 p.m., and then that would be the end of his day. And he kind of really kept those lines in place. He was good about it, I think, for my sake, probably for my mother's sake too, or vice versa. Um, there was a lot of time with him. He was not the kind of person who was going to be burning the midnight oil working or working all day Saturday and Sunday. He was quite present in most of the ways that matter. But he was steady. There really weren't any breaks. My father did not take vacations. My father did not like go away for the weekend. My father did not go out and get drunk and then spend the next day like on the couch with a washcloth on his head or anything like that. So, steady, steady worker.
so do you think? I mean, reading this again, I maybe think it's possibly that this book was a response to his years at Grove, reading a lot of manuscripts, just stuff that came in and some of the books. And I mean, because there's references to, the books like the sweat of love, and the writer's helper, and the psychic guy, Basheri. What, what what do you think? And different writers. There's the McCoy guy. There's Dermo Trellis, and they're all writing kind of. Anthony Lamont is more like the real artist, and these guys are hacks. Or he seems to be making fun of different authors too during the book, like maybe like a Louis L'Amour type book, and then he has like the one chapter with drawings that seems like a little Thomas Pynchon-esque. What do you think this is? Kind of a reflection on the Grove years, and just that whole publishing. I mean, it seems like he knows a lot about publishing by this time.
I think he knew a lot about publishing by that time. I'm not sure if it was about Grove per se. I think it may have just been drawn from his experience as a writer in the world over the course of the preceding, 2 decades or so. And, you know, I mean, having been a writer myself for over 30 years, if you publish, if you hang around, if you teach, if you ever serve as an editor or a guest editor or a judge on a prize panel or whatever, you do come into contact with a lot of different pros of, varying levels of infirmity. And, my father was always kind of fascinated with those kinds of mistakes, I think. Mistakes by which I mean works that are misconceived, badly executed, and informed by cliches. And I think my father was always really interested in ways of, recombining those things into something interesting, taking the ineptitude, taking the language that should have been beaten to death, or taking the language that kind of had been twisted by a shaky sense of syntax or grammar, and trying to make something new out of it. And I think that's pretty much what Mulligan's Stew was. And I think several books after that too kind of went back to that sort of badness as a model for transformation thing. Um, I don't know if there are any particular writers who he had in mind. I do know that you're right. There were certain parodies in the book. I think that the section chats with the real McCoy, which I'm not sure if you've gotten to yet in your
Oh no,
book.
I've finished the book. Yeah, that's
Oh,
real
okay.
early on.
Okay. So I think that chats with the real McCoy was actually based on Nabokov, who my father was never a big admirer of for reasons that for a long time I didn't quite understand until more or less recently, maybe the last 10 years, I started seeing what it was about Nabokov that rubbed my father the wrong way. I don't agree with him 100%, but I see what was bothering him about Nabokov's work. Um, and yeah, it was basically a sustained parody or a series of parodies that were put together. I would like to correct you in one respect, which is that I think Anthony Lamont is supposed to be every bit as bad a writer as the writers that he doesn't like. I think my father's excerpts from his various novels, I can't remember their name, Baltimore Chop and Three Deuces and a couple of others, um,
Rayon Violet.
Rayon Violet. I think all of those
No,
were,
I was just saying that Anthony Lamont thought that he was the true artist, and that he was having a battle over Dermo Trellis. Like, oh, that guy's writing crappy sexualized novels, and I'm the true artist. Yeah, but he ends up, the from what we see, is pretty bad.
yeah, I think that was definitely the intention. So it's an interesting book really because it's a book in which there's this constant comparison or an implicit comparison made to so-called good writing, whatever that might consist of, like platonically in your imagination, but no examples of that good writing ever actually manifest themselves within the book. So you have this book that's like all parody and all implication, but no actual presentation of the idealized object.
Well, I mean, this book is it has different parts. We get we get the first chapter presented to us three times, rewritten, and it kind of starts out sort of like a detective novel, like, oh, there's a murder, or is there a murder, and and then you have a lot of those metaphors, like, Mickey Spillane, kind of like, the pavement was as hot as something or other, and like just like constant metaphor. But and then we have like letters, and we have like a little his scrapbook. But in a proper detective novel, there's always sort of like a prologue, where the murder happens and stuff, and then we go back and we find out how the murder. So is the prologue the murder scene? Is that those rejection letters? Is that the real crime in this book?
That certainly was one crime. I guess that the editors who are being skewered in that section are accessories to the crime, certainly, but that was actually an afterthought. And I don't remember exactly how it came into being, but at some point after Grove had accepted the book, the idea came about that my father should preface the book with the rejection letters that the book had received. And I think that Barney was a little concerned that, given that he was still in publishing and that a lot of these were people he had to work with and deal with, he was a little concerned about, exposure, if not liability. So he kind of prevailed upon my father to change the names. And so my father did, and the names come from all sorts of different books. Like there's Harry White, who's from Hubert Selby's The Demon. There's Yvonne Furman, who is the wife of the consul in Under the Volcano. There's Morrow Reef, who was the main character in Wallace Markfield's To an Early Grave. There's Flo Dowell, who was the wife of John Dowell in The Good Soldier, et cetera, et cetera. And so my father just decided to rewrite the letters, sometimes barely. I mean, I should mention that my father would get these rejection letters often, in the mail, which would arrive around lunchtime, and he would sit there. I remember him doing this at least on a couple of occasions where he would sit there and he would read the letters aloud to me or to me and my mother. He would do it to whoever was around. I mean, I think he was going a little crazy at this point because it had been circulating for 2 years, 3 years. That's a long time. I've had a book circulate for a year and a half or so, and it's maddening. And so I do recall that the letters often used many of the phrases that appear in the fake letters that are in the beginning of the book. So yeah, that is in a sense the crime, but I do think that the real opening chapter, the one that appears after the title page, sets out the kind of aftermath scene where I think the first line of the book is how absurd it is to find myself in this dilemma. And it's uh oh gosh, Martin Halpin narrating the scene. And what's the name of the character from Nick, the guy from the glass the glass key?
Oh,
Uh,
I don't know.
the main character
Oh,
who's
well, there's Anthony Lamont and Martin Halperin and Ned Beaumont.
Ned Beaumont. Ned Beaumont. So Ned's dead, and Martin is wondering how he found himself. And so that's the kind of more typical murder mystery scene that you're talking about. Like, let me reconstruct all of this from this vantage of the crime having been committed, and none of us know what's going on.
So yeah, so Gilbert Sorrentino like was inspired by It Swim Two Birds. I just read this. I mean, this is a more conventional novel. It's a novelist writing a novel about a novelist writing a novel,
Yeah,
and
I mean, I don't know if I'd call it conventional, but yeah, it's
yeah, I mean, and he pulls from this. I mean, in Mulligan Stew, it's more like, there. It's like there's the writer, and then he has like his characters, and they're like locked up in a cabin somewhere and that's where Martin Halperin and Ned Beaumont are, and they're just waiting around, and waiting to be used and stuff, and they're just kind of like looking through the books and that are in the cabin, and the cabin has different rooms. They discover a new room. They find like some that's where they find the mask of fungo, and yeah, I didn't really think about that too hard, these were characters like locked in a cabin waiting to be used by any author, and that's how he kind of explains the
yeah,
speed of Mulligan Stew. So
yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
so I mean, I listened to like a little YouTube video about swim tube birds, and he kind of went through like all like he like how Flat O'Brien was real popular in the 40s and 50s, and then he kind of had a resurgence in the 70s, they compared a lot of writers to him, like Italo Calvino, and I guess Borges like wrote an early review of A Swim Two Birds, um, and then um, and then he mentioned Gilbert Sorrentino, but he also talked about B.S. Johnson as maybe an influence. Like I know you're a big fan of B.S. Johnson. Who should I read? What book should I read by B.S. Johnson that's really good? Check out.
Uh, well, I guess the one that I started with is maybe still my favorite. It's called Christy Mallory's Own Double Entry. It's about a young accountant who decides to apply the double entry bookkeeping method to life itself. So for every debit that life takes, like, denying him a seat on the underground or what have you, he manages to enact a credit by committing some small act of vandalism or what have you. And so this escalates as the book progresses until finally Christie, the hero, um, poisons the entire water supply of London. And then Johnson intervenes as a kind of deus ex machina and gives Christie metastatic cancer. And that's when the book kind of comes to a close. And I read that book when I was about 19 or 20, and I was very affected by it. I mean, I think I had known that books could do this sort of thing, but I never really kind of experienced it. Some would say it's a schematic book. B.S. Johnson would almost certainly say that it was a schematic book. He liked the idea of books having a schema, and his books often did. But I would really read any of them. The ones that I think you find most easily are Christy Mallory, House Mother Normal, which is also very formally, rigidly arranged about a bunch of people in an old age home, and and maybe The Unfortunates, which is the famous book where Johnson arranged to have it distributed in unbound signatures so that you could rearrange the book in any order you wanted in order to read it. And in a sense, a lot of these are, you know, experiments that are maybe not groundbreaking in the sense that they led to constant imitation. There's nothing Joycean or Hemingway-esque there, where suddenly these kinds of experiments are leading to, constant iterations that get farther and farther away from the original model while still referring back to it. But I found them pretty interesting and pretty influential because I realized that you really could do a lot with novels, a lot with what is, uh, a lot to subvert the kind of consistency of tone, register, voice, the unities that kind of tend to tend to hold the contemporary novel together, especially today, that a kind of naturalism is, in the ascent and has been for quite a while. But yeah, he was, I'm not sure if they influenced, if Johnson was an influence or if they were just kind of contemporaries working, working somewhat apart from each other. I would say that, say, a steelwork with its sections that are not arranged chronologically, but that track a neighborhood for like 25 years, works in a lot of the same ways as a book like The Unfortunates with its unbound signatures. I would say that the self-reflexive authorial intrusions of Christy Mallory's own double entry really do harken back to the self-reflexive authorial intrusions, excuse me, of an imaginative qualities of actual things. So they were really working in the same vein, and I think that what kind of united them both is, unlike a lot of other authors who we tend to think of as postmodern, like Pynchon or John Fowles or DeLillo, for that matter, or even a Barth. I think that both my father and Johnson were drawing very consciously from modernism as opposed to trying to delineate a break from that. And I don't know how Johnson thought about it. I do know that my father never like very explicitly thought of himself as like the last of the modernists or a member of the postmodernists. I just don't think that he adhered to those kinds of labels. And I think he was generally a little annoyed or irked when they were applied to him, because I don't think that he ever really identified either with the labels or with the other authors to whom those labels were typically applied. He admired them, but some of them, but he definitely did not think of himself as being in their camp.
Yeah, the so I would like to point out that the Mulligan Stew is a semi-epistolary novel. There's letters to Sheila Henry, his sister, Anthony Lamont, Sheila Lamont. Those could probably, the letters to Sheila could probably make up a book of its own. He
It
has like
probably
he has letters to Dr. Roach and the Bishari, the psychic. And then there's the whole chapter of Burst love letters, which is pretty funny. And I noticed that in '79 also we have John Barth letters where I don't know if you read this book, but it's like all his characters from his previous five novels, including the author, writing letters to each other. So it's kind of a shared kind of conceit of this kind of metafictional kind of universe of so I mean you just mentioned Barth a few minutes ago. Did you have you read that book or you kind
I've
of
never read letters. No.
yeah,
But
okay.
I think, yeah, I mean, I think Barth and my father were simpatico. I don't believe that they ever met. I think, I think that I would be hard pressed to say what my father thought of John Barth, and I have no idea what John Barth thought of my father. But I do know that we had some of his books around the house, and so I'm sure that they were aware of what they were doing. I mean, it seems to me that, like, to quote Barth on the idea of the literature of exhaustion, or just to refer to that idea, I would say that a lot of writers working at that time, writers whose reputations have risen and fallen, but who are kind of unavoidable, if you want to understand anything about American fiction in particular after the war, we're working in the same vein, working with the same idea that the way to structure a novel, the way to tell a story, had been pretty much tapped out, and there needed to be new ways of arranging it. So we're talking about Barth, we're talking about Hawkes, we're talking about Coover, we're talking about Pynchon, we're talking about Joseph McElroy, we're talking about writers who nobody's heard of, like I don't know, Eden Higgins from Ireland, a guy named Ken Tyndall, who I think ended up publishing two novels and working for his entire life. He was an American, but he ended up spending his adult life working in Denmark as a postman. Um, Toby Olson, his books, especially his earlier ones like Seaview and The Woman Who Escaped from Shame, which is one of my favorite books. Anyway, not to make a large list, but just to say that there were a lot of writers, many of them Anglophonic, working at the exact same time and working out of that same conceit. Like, what do we do when literature seems to have reached its terminal point, especially since it seems to have reached it at precisely the same time as all sorts of like very engaging and very seductive mass media have appeared to sort of draw attention away from what used to be a reading public. And of course, now we find that problem in the second quarter of the 21st century to be even more pronounced.
Yeah, and you can even include uh, Cabrera, Fonte, like the Three Trapped Tigers, and Cortazar, Hopscotch, and
Mhm.
Julian Rios Larva is kind of. So yeah, I mean, what you were talking about before. I mean, there's a quote I got like during the reading of this book. I found this issue of Review of Contemporary Fiction from 2011, edited by Stephanie Sobel, and she was a student at Stanford, and they quote he says about Mulligan Stew, in this book I would like to do what I've always wanted to do, is to put into the book sections verbatim from other works of mine, books, stories, poems, essays, reviews. I would like to bust the goddamn novel apart and put it back together again for once and for all, and prove to myself that fiction is real unto itself, that it is a total invention, that it is total prose, that it is absolute reality of fiction that matters in terms of writing fiction. Any comment on that?
Well, I mean, I think that's certainly the direction his career took from that point onward. I mean, I think it may have begun earlier, really. I mean, I think there's nothing more artificial than, excuse me, than the kind of the the raison d'etre of a book like Splendide Hotel, for example, which is like it takes the alphabet as its structural starting point, and each of the components of it are more or less discrete and drawn from, what materials he had to hand. I think that it becomes increasingly artificial with something like Mulligan Stew, where the reference points that the the book is using are not drawn really from life at all, but they're drawn from other books, they're drawn from popular songs, they're drawn from advertising copy, they're drawn from old movies, they're drawn from brand names for products that no longer exist. So it's really a book made out of garbage, and I think that he extends that uh, to a certain degree in Crystal Vision, which was not the next book of his to appear, but it appeared shortly afterwards. I think he does that in the trilogy, Odd Number and Rose Theater and Mysterioso. And he does that in Under the Shadow. And then I think his books begin to come out of that period where they're kind of infernally insular, And I do find those books to be, more difficult to read on a sort of I'm going to sit down and read for a few hours basis. One has to take them very slowly, and one can, you at the same time as you're taking them very slowly, there's nothing about these books that demands the kind of readerly immersion that like without which you might find yourself like outside of the book. I think you're always outside of the book. You're always sort of poking around at an object that's made out of things. And that's the kind of artifice my father was talking about. And like I said, in his later books, his last several novels, I think he emerges from that somewhat. I think that his books begin to uh, come down to earth and say, to use a word I rarely use, they become more relatable to the reader. And I think that if you were to read one of those books and try and compare it to, say, Mulligan Stew or Blue Pastoral or one of the other books that are like really just incrustations upon incrustations, like you'd find it hard to believe that they were written by the same person.
Yeah, we're kind of running out of time here. So, but I would like to mention, like, I just reread The Moon in its Flight recently, like a couple weeks ago, and I think that that's a pretty relatable story. I think it takes place in the either the 40s or the early 50s, and I think it has everything a lot of the Sorrentino fictions have. It has like it's like Brooklyn and New York, uh, a lot of his pop culture references. I think there's some baseball in there, and I and it just kind of I think it's really it's a story that's really teachable, in a class or something. Like people can read it and get something out of it, and it really sparkles in a way whereas maybe and I think people would have time for something like that. What do you say?
I think so. I mean, I think that first of all, I think that whether you know it or not, that's absolutely the case. I think that's one of the pieces of my father's work that people do tend to read. It does tend to get assigned in classes. I remember, I can't remember if she told me this directly or if I heard about it from someone else, but Lori Moore once said that, trying to teach my father's novels is really kind of a non-starter in her classroom. She's tried it a few times, and, that kind of makes me sad. But it doesn't surprise me, having taught grad students myself, that they do tend to resist those sorts of things, especially in large doses, unless they're very singular students with a singular kind of approach to or enthusiasm for fiction. But yeah, I think that my father is pretty easy to teach depending on the book and what the so-called learning objective, as you put on the syllabus, is. For example, I think you could teach The Moon in Its Flight. I think you could teach Aberration of Starlight, which is a book that works like a wind-up toy. And so it's a really good way of saying, like, here's how you assemble a book so that it works perfectly and also manages to have a kind of affective effect on on the people who are reading it.
Okay, well, I think we're done here. Thank
Okay.
thank you for talking to me, and everybody check out books by Chris Sorrentino. Buy
Don't
them,
forget the Substack address.
and the Substack. Check out the Substack,
Put it
and
on, put it
uh,
on a superimposition on the bottom of the screen,
yeah,
Alexander.
yeah, it's gonna. Oh, should I?
Yeah, you definitely should. I want people to subscribe. I do it
Yeah, yeah,
for
yeah.
for
Subscribe
you,
to it.
everybody.
Send them some money, and buy his books,
It's
and
free.
it.
It's Substack is free. You can read that for free, and then you can buy the books for money. But
Okay,
like, you definitely should go because I'm putting some time into it.
okay.
And Alexander, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. You're looking well.
Yeah, I'm doing good, and we'll talk another time. Okay, thank you.
All right, bye.